see all of you here, and nice to have one of our own as our guest today. Sarah joined the faculty here as an assistant professor and was highly productive and influential, and everybody fell in love with her on top of that. And so, in its wisdom, the Annenberg School and the University of Southern California offered her tenure and promotion last year, and she was gracious enough to accept it. So
it was a big decision.
Let's give her a hand.
Thank you.
There's no need for elaborate introductions for our own folk. I'll spend a little bit more time with people from off campus in the future. One of the things that I thought was interesting was that one of the books that she published was entitled The Most Beautiful Girl in the World. And I was wondering whether you watched the Mrs. America pageant that was on television over the weekend.
I did not. I haven't been able to actually watch a pageant for several years since the publication of that book.
Well, she's also published a number of other things. But today she's going to talk with us about the work she's been doing on a forthcoming book by Duke University Press. The name of the book is Kids Only, Children, Citizenship, and Nickelodeon. And I think today you're going to talk about Nickelodeon, youth, and citizenship. So, sounds great. Our own Sarah Benet-White.
I'm going to stand because I do better standing. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to just kind of talk. I've just finished this book on the children's cable television channel Nickelodeon, and I'm going to present some of the work from that book here. I'm going to just kind of give an overview of some of the ideas I present in the book because I would really love to get a discussion going about these issues and about youth culture and citizenship and race and gender. So I'm going to give a brief overview. I'm going to show a very quick clip in case some of you, it's very hard to believe for me, but in case some of you have not seen the program Dora the Explorer, I wanted to share that with you because I've seen it a lot. And so I'm just going to show a quick clip of that as a way to kind of demonstrate some of these ideas. My interest in Nickelodeon doesn't really stem from a long-standing interest in kids and media. I was not kind of trained in the field of children and media. This was not something that I had kind of focused my research interest in initially as a scholar. I'm kind of more generally interested in the different roles that the media play in the construction of national identity and in contemporary understandings of citizenship. This is the point of entry for me for the work on Nickelodeon and on kids and media. And I see it as a kind of extension of my earlier work that Peter had mentioned on gender, citizenship, and national identity. So in that earlier work and the beauty pageant book, I looked at the beauty pageant as a site where women negotiated identity through dominant norms of femininity, feminism, and nationalism. In this current work, I'm looking at commercial media, and specifically television, as a way to kind of investigate some similar sorts of questions and negotiations. I look at TV not simply because it remains the most popular medium, although, of course, that is kind of demographically organized, and the internet is clearly kind of threatening its position as the most popular. But I'm actually more interested in the way in which television has this kind of remarkable stubbornness to remain in public consciousness as a kind of public sphere, as a place in which we construct national citizenship and or national identity and citizenship. I mean, and we all know that this is a point of contention. We don't actually need Habermas to remind us of the ways in which TV as a commercial institution doesn't quite fulfill the obligations of a public sphere, and how it doesn't actually serve the public interest of its viewers. It's actually quite easy to point to the ways in which television fails in that regard. However, I do think to simply state that TV is a commercial medium and thus is not concerned with a notion of the public is oversimplifying its importance and oversimplifying its cultural power as a metaphor of the public sphere. So I am looking at commercial television and looking at this, this media space as a place where these two discourses of consumerism and national citizenship kind of create each other, mutually constitutive, in this contemporary media climate. And how it is that American audiences most powerfully understand themselves as consumers in kind of terms of consumer citizenship and the terms I'm arguing are offered to them by the media. What I'm not interested in doing in this work is maintaining, and we can have a lively discussion about this afterwards, but what I'm not interested in doing is maintaining a divisive separation between consumption and politics, because I think that we spend a lot of energy on proving that that division exists. And what ends up happening is that we kind of remain in this position of a kind of paralyzed nostalgia, lamenting the commodification of politics to the extent that political action no longer seems possible or no longer even seems desirable. I understand the commercial media to play a pivotal role in creating cultural definitions about what it means to be a citizen, and it is my argument that our sense of ourselves as national citizens emerges from and not in spite of our engagement with the popular media. So in this way, I kind of position myself or argue against a kind of simplistic anti-consumerism. We're all consumers. We're not likely to turn back the clock. Most of us don't want to, and or at least not completely. I think that if we cede power over to those who have the greatest control over capital, we really will forfeit some of the current ways we can demonstrate agency and that we have exercised political action. So if the commercial media might not look like the ideal space to fight battles over rights and freedoms, I still think that its possibilities for this are worth exploring. So I take this idea about consumer citizenship and it kind of provides the book with its theoretical foundation. How I think about consumer citizenship as tensions that are contained in definitions of citizenship that are produced through opposing cultural relations in late capitalist U.S. society. So the resulting understanding of citizenship by both the media and the citizen herself or himself is informed by these opposing kinds of subjectivity. Citizens are, of course, always consumers. And so they are, in this media environment, trained to be selfish, to be individualistic, to be loyal to goods and services. However, despite this the power of consumer society, there is a more traditional political notion of the citizen that I think continues to linger as a kind of residual identity, one that is community-minded and selfless. And so what happens, I think, that is in media and brand culture, consumer citizenship is achieved through an apparent resolving of these two subjectivities, or this split subjectivity, through the marketing of identities, not only as a kind of brand, but more so as members of a community itself. So in this way, the community-minded individual is still created, but the community itself is part of a brand. So I set out to look at how this works, how consumer citizenship is constituted within the framework of children's television for a couple of different reasons. One, in the last 5 to 10 years, there's been a heightened debate about the consumption habits of young American kids. We have popular books that lament kids' spending habits that are often kind of hyperbolically titled "Born to Buy," or my favorite one is Branded: The Buying and Selling of American Teenagers, because I have a brand new teenager, and anyone who wants to buy him, he is for sale. We have news magazines that moralize about superficial spending, telling parents in the favorite rhetoric of this country to just say no to kids' extravagant demands for things like iPods and all sorts of electronic gadgets and so on and so forth. We have lots of narrative themes in kids and tween programming on television about the problems that come with being an excessive consumer at so young an age. So we have this kind of moralizing discourse about the problem of being, the corruption, the commercial corruption of America's youth. Not surprisingly, alongside this more, kind of negative discourse, there's another more optimistic interpretation of the current generation's spending habits. And this interpretation is, of course, primarily an economic one that celebrates the child consumer. And there's good reason to celebrate if you are a marketer. In the early 21st century, children are spending more and more. They have increasingly sophisticated consumption habits. They continue to influence the purchases that their parents make. And their general ethos is one of brand culture. So the obvious contradictions involved in the commercial media moralizing about a cultural climate that provides for their very existence mirrors some of the contradictions surrounding how young Americans are hailed as both citizens in training and consumers in contemporary culture. And when examining children's media to see this kind of dynamic happening, it's absolutely impossible to ignore the significance of Nickelodeon, which is potentially the most popular and influential producer of children's programming media in the U.S. and increasingly throughout the world today. For those of you who don't know, Nickelodeon is a division of Viacom International. It's delivered via satellite. It's a 24-hour channel, and it's a network of children's programs with millions of subscribers and it kind of targets a broad child and adult audience. Nickelodeon is the most successful cable channel in history. Not the most successful children's channel, the most successful cable channel in history. And it's worked aggressively to claim and maintain its position and image as the preeminent distributor of television programs for young children, tweens, and teens in the U.S. The channel's success has been possible in part because of its segmented programming that was initially quite unique, and now you see it a lot more in children's channels. But it's segmented programming that appeals to all age groups. So you have preschool programming in the morning, you have young children's programming in the afternoon, pre-adolescent and adolescent programming in the later afternoon, tween. Everyone know what I mean when I say tween? Between kid and adult. Tween programming in the evening. And then in the later evening, you've got Nick at Night, which is a nostalgic programming lineup of reruns of older family shows ranging from, Petticoat Junction to Family Ties to The Cosby Show to Who's the Boss. In the last quarter of 2004, all of the 10 highest-rated television shows watched by children under 12 on both broadcast and cable were Nickelodeon programs. So its kind of reach is truly impressive. Aside from the actual program lineup, Nickelodeon has also garnered critical acclaim for its original programming, which features both animated and non-animated programs that have as their primary selling point the idea that the channel addresses kids as kids. Nickelodeon's reach and influence does not stop, as we well know, at TV programming. The Nickelodeon produced movies such as the Rugrats movie and the SpongeBob SquarePants movie and Lemony Snicket, and there's a whole host of others, are also a staple of kids' media. And in fact, the Rugrats movie was the first children's movie in the U.S. that grossed over, the first non-Disney kids movie that grossed over $100 million. We, of course, have manufacturing aplenty. As just a brief glance in any kind of schoolyard or mall or athletic field will show, or my house, for many of the products that are purchased by or for kids are licensed by Nickelodeon. You have SpongeBob SquarePants T-shirts for babies up to adults. You have Dora the Explorer lunchboxes and backpacks. You have Rugrats toys. You have Blue's Clues plush animals. All of these things have a place within the consumption ethos in which U.S. children surround themselves. Because of the flexibility of a cable network's programming, where Nickelodeon can air exclusively children's programs 15 hours a day, there are more resources, and there is thus more potential to create innovative and even at times risky programs, especially and this is also kind of held more for when Nickelodeon was initially developing program, but especially when compared with the more economically constrained broadcast networks. Nickelodeon has been brilliant at using this flexibility to create a brand image that, again, at least initially looked like no other children's channel. Nickelodeon claims that it respects kids, that it empowers them, and that above all else, it is a kids-only media community, one that is hip and cool. In this way, Nickelodeon has consciously crafted its identity to provide a kind of balance within that contradictory dynamic of consumerism and politics that I was discussing earlier. By claiming to respect kids, the network responds to cultural anxieties about protecting kids as it simultaneously frames this respect as a crucial part of its brand identity. So Nickelodeon's claim to be on the side of kids is similar to the way advertisers construct child audiences as sophisticated, media-savvy, and enthusiastic consumers. At the same time, the network's conscious attention to children's culture reassures parents and educators that watching Nickelodeon will not deter proper social and political development. So they do a lot of kind of more traditionally political things. They hold Kids Pick the President kind of campaign during election years, which is a program that allows kids to kind of vote for their choice for president and to hear opinions about the presidential race from a kid's point of view. Right now they have a nationwide initiative for kids to do community service and community work to help Hurricane Katrina victims. So they have these kind of gestures towards political activity. Nickelodeon knows quite well that determining the political agency of children is a fraught process and difficult to define, and that what it means to have agency is not as simple as empowering children to act in either the consumer or the political world. So the channel has worked really diligently to offer a particular kind of agency that focuses on the exclusivity of kids' culture, so that part of their explicit mission is to air programs that kids like to watch, not those that their parents would like them to watch. And so in the words of the employee handbook, Nickelodeon is a network, quote, dedicated to empowering kids, a place where kids could take a break and get a break. So Nickelodeon's original media productions represent a shift in not only the kinds of shows that appeal to children, but also a fundamental shift in how kids are addressed in and through the media. And so, my argument in the book is that the network speaks then in expansive terms to this moment in the history of television, where it impacts not only children's programming, but the cable industry, media conglomerates, global television, and the shifting power structure of television networks. I think that Nick represents a historical juncture in U.S. media and commercial culture, and that and really kind of focuses on the role, or allows us to focus on the role that the communication technology of cable cable television plays in this juncture. Cable is crucial here for this argument, because those tensions between consumer citizenship and political citizenship are maintained by the media industry within which Nickelodeon is situated. It's precisely that structure of cable that allows for this more innovative and active address to a youth audience, even as this industry remains structured around competitive commercial interests. So cable itself is built on a kind of similar type of contradiction. This media context of Nickelodeon provides youth culture with commodities, a class-based definition of cool culture, an idealistic and inaccurate picture of a harmonious multicultural youth population. It also provides opportunities for talking and thinking about rights, belonging, group membership, and perhaps even political action. Often these opportunities are immediately co-opted by corporate culture, but nonetheless there is potential here, I think, within this environment for a kind of meaningful consumer citizenship to be constituted. So in the book, I look at how I think this is happening from a variety of different perspectives, and through programming, through industry practice, through representation. So I kind of theorize the programming and industry strategies through this set of tensions. When media corporations such as Nickelodeon produce programming that structures representations around a market-driven code of cool and hip, it's a reminder of Naomi Klein's discussion in her book about brand culture of the ways in which the current corporate climate produces a market that thinks it is culture. Arlene Davila, in her study of Latino identity in advertising, reminds us that this dynamic works in the opposite direction as well, where advertising agencies and media corporations produce culture for the market. So this dynamic between producing culture for the market and creating a market that thinks it is culture structures much of Nickelodeon's brand identity, and I use this model as a way to examine how Nickelodeon represents race and gender in its programming. So that's kind of a quick overview of the my general theoretical position. I'm going to move now to talk specifically about race and gender as practices of consumer citizenship. Racial representation on Nickelodeon relies upon a cultural definition of race as not a material politics or a system of oppression, but rather as a kind of street-urban style, an individual characteristic, and a commercial product. In this way, Nickelodeon affirms a cultural politics of race as something that signifies the urban, but as a brand identity, rather than a cultural identity specifically connected to power. Like race, gender identity is also constructed in the present post-feminist cultural economy as a flexible, celebratory identity category that is presented in all its various manifestations as a kind of product that one can buy or try on. So signified by this hip consumer slogan, girl power, post-feminist gender identity is a very slippery category, precisely because of the ways that it intervenes productively in traditional patriarchal frameworks, even as it works in other ways to shore up precisely those same frameworks. So these two identity categories, race as an urban style and girl power, function together in the current media environment to create categories of identity that are defined by their ambiguity rather than specificity, their ambivalence rather than political certainty. These mediated forms of race and gender are produced within the specific context of late industrial capitalism in the U.S. So this moment that has been characterized in racial terms as a multicultural society or even as a post-race society, and in gender terms as a post-feminist culture. And I think that these two identity categories, or these two features of contemporary U.S. media culture, function together as a productive kind of tension. And I think that cable television, and especially Nickelodeon, is a kind of interesting space to theorize this tension because of the flexibility of cable and because of the significance of the youth market. The tension between race and gender and this way resides within the acknowledgement that race and gender are important identity categories to consider in terms of representation, while at the same time this acknowledgement itself works to repudiate this very importance. Angela McRobbie has written about this, and she talks about how it works in post-feminism, and she says that contemporary popular culture is very effective in what she calls the undoing of feminism, precisely by appearing to participate in an inclusion of feminist ideologies. I think a similar dynamic is working with current popular representations of race. So within the contemporary climate, TV and media products seem to acknowledge the historical racist landscape of television by not only featuring programming with casts that include people of color, but also by incorporating a kind of non-white narrative in ads and in programs and in merchandise. Yet these particular representations and narratives of race and ethnicity are marketed by media corporations like Nick as cool, authentic, and urban, and have proven, as we all know, to be incredibly lucrative economic tools for marketing to broad, especially white audiences. So contemporary marketers who sell clothing like Tommy Hilfiger or soft drinks like Sprite have efficiently capitalized on the connection of cool with images and narratives of the urban, so that popular culture is rife with what Herman Gray discusses are proliferation of differences rather than absence of differences. Traditional arguments in this scenario about disenfranchisement are foreclosed then by what appears to be an easy accessibility of diversity. Right? So because diversity is all around us, and because we wear diversity and we can buy diversity, and because we have a multicultural society, we don't actually need to talk about diversity anymore. It's evident, and it's evidenced by corporate culture. So this is a very different scenario than 10 years ago. And this redefinition of the urban stands in contrast to media representations in the U.S. of the urban in the 1980s and early 90s, which predominantly signified, as we all know, the dangerous other as connected to the urban. Importantly, though, this redefinition of the urban functions to render irrelevant and repudiate those earlier concerns about racist imagery. So the representation of the urban, like the representation of girl power, is associated with this ideological notion that the U.S. is a multicultural post-feminist society, and racial discrimination or gender discrimination and racial difference are no longer seen as salient. Race, like gender, comes to us in this contemporary context as a commodity, and as such, the kind of ideologies that shape the representational practices of race and gender need to be rethought and kind of theorized within this context. Another part of the way in which race and gender are represented in media is through kind of a framing around generational differences. In terms of gender representation, this generational difference most often appears in this what appears to be an ideological struggle between second wave feminism and post-feminism. And this particular generational divide revolves most centrally around the general assumption, one that is supported by commercial popular culture, that the goals of feminism have been largely accomplished, and they are in fact history. So it kind of renders it unnecessary to continue to rehash old political issues. And feminists themselves come to seem kind of old-fashioned and cranky. Right? So when one of my students wears a T-shirt that says, pay to touch, and I object, or question or whatever, I am this cranky kind of old-fashioned feminist who doesn't understand that what post-feminism is about is celebration of the body and irony and, kind of using these stereotypes on their head to celebrate bodily pleasure. So not that I have a personal issue with this or anything. Nothing going on there. Regarding post-racial culture, these generational differences have a more specific economic angle. And those of you who know the work of Chris Smith, who is also one of our very own, have heard him speak or read his writing on this. Chris Smith calls this kind of moment the new economy, and says that in the late 20th and early 21st century, the tropes of the urban are used as a means to designate a particular national perspective on diversity. So despite material realities of poverty, of unemployment, of a general institutionalized racism that carries on as busily today as it did 20 years ago, a contemporary ideology about race casts race as a style and as an aesthetic. So like commodity feminism, or what Bonnie Dow has identified as primetime feminism, the commodification of the urban works to diffuse the politics from this particular racial formation so that it results in a kind of racial ambivalence that dominates then the representational landscape. So it dominates the way in which we see this represented. So given this contemporary representational context, then what are the consequences when race or gender become a kind of cultural capital, a competency, or a mode of consumption within the world of media entertainment? I think that representation itself becomes arsenal in a kind of cultural territory war. And within this particular battlefield, the struggles of the past to represent women and people of color are read through a nostalgic lens as a kind of old school kind of politics. And, again, just like the cranky feminist, contemporary manifestations of the urban render the language of disenfranchisement as old-fashioned and even kind of quaint, and aren't we glad that we're no longer there? The dismissal of the language and the power differences invoked by this language are characteristic of, what might be called a new school kind of politics, where commodity culture is situated not in opposition to these politics, but rather provides the very means to exploit and represent those dynamics of race and gender. Okay, so where does Nickelodeon fit in this media culture? Nickelodeon's brand identity has a very clear connection to a post-feminist urban style. It is widely celebrated for very good reasons for its efforts to champion girls and what has been a historically male-dominated televisual landscape. Nickelodeon, probably more than any other children's channel, has, forced, and Donna can speak to this because she was part of all of this movement. Nickelodeon really forced the attention of parents and young people to the connection between the two concepts of girl and power, so that it was something more than just another hip slogan to put on a T-shirt. And this connection has become normalized within the discourses of consumer culture. So in the contemporary culture, the empowerment of girls is now something that are more or less taken for granted by both kids and their parents. It's certainly been incorporated, like I said, into commodity culture, so that you can, buy a T-shirt for a 4-year-old. Not that says pay to touch, although you probably could, but one that says girls kick ass, or girls rule, or girls, or I hate boys, which is a whole other thing that we. But there's a whole kind of commodity-driven notion of empowerment that then gets kind of stamped on commodity objects that is about this kind of girls rule, girl power. Nickelodeon was absolutely crucial in the normalization of this slogan. Like other brands, though, in contemporary media culture, what Nickelodeon did was tap into this commodity-driven empowerment by targeting aspects of personal identity, such as gender and race, as a way to be inclusive. So its brand identity is crafted around the network is different, how the network is different from other children's media, because it empowers children through an image of gender, through an image or its commitment to racial representation. On the other hand, Nickelodeon's ability to claim that diversity matters has proved very strategic from a business standpoint. So this kind of positioning of the network as different is a positioning that says it's different in the competitive field of children's television. So despite the very well-intentioned goals of a channel to empower children, Nickelodeon's carefully crafted industry identity as the diversity channel and as a champion for girls is a lucrative business strategy. So within the world of children's television, and again, Donna has really given me a lot of insight about this, representations of race and gender are important because it increases the political and social clout of a network to be able to claim that it is diverse. So it no longer makes commercial sense to ignore women or people of color in representation or as important characters. And Nickelodeon has, again, capitalized on this historical invisibility and exclusion of diverse characters and has framed this history as part of its brand identity and as part of a shrewd business strategy. So its decision to create diverse programming is often discussed by Nickelodeon in non-specific terms as good business, thus distancing the channel from the political implications of actually embracing diversity. So to demonstrate how this works and some of the actual programming, I'm going to just look very quickly at this very successful Nickelodeon program, Dora the Explorer. And my argument is that Dora, who is an intrepid 7-year-old Latina girl on the show, is poised as a kind of global citizen within this cultural economy of race and gender that I've just been discussing. Dora the Explorer is produced for Nick Jr. So it's part of their preschool lineup, and it really embodies, I think, some of the these contradictory discourses of race and gender that are celebrated in this contemporary media context. Dora, it's an animated show. Again, she's a 7-year-old Latina with dark skin and brown eyes. She speaks both Spanish and English throughout the program. In every episode, the narrative revolves around solving a puzzle or a mystery, such as how to find a frog's lost voice or how to save a baby jaguar. The show encourages a kind of interactive behavior on the part of audience. So the whole show is kind of structured like a computer game with a cursor and everything else. So there's a cursor that clicks on the right answer when Dora asks the audience for help. There are pauses in the program where Dora looks at the audience, which for an adult is a little bit kind of creepy, as you just sit there and there's nothing going on and she's just blinking at you. And I'm going to show you some of that. But she asks questions of her audience. She waits for them to reply to her questions about the daily mystery. She encourages, again, this kind of active interaction on the part of the preschool audience. This emphasis on audience interaction is nothing new to Dora. It's very typical for many contemporary kids' television programs where creators have done a lot of research about the pedagogical potential of TV and how we can use the TV more interactively to teach kind of learning skills and so on and so forth. But I also think that it speaks to a more general cultural shift that is signified by kind of post-feminist ideology that recognizes media audiences as kind of active, savvy consumers, even at the age of 2 and 3 and 4. Textually, the tropes of post-feminism and the urban are evident in the overall aesthetic style of the show. So, not just including an intelligent girl as a lead character, but also celebrating a kind of racial authenticity through the physical representation of Dora, the names of the other characters on the show, and the general kind of style of the program. So the show features both human and animal characters, most of whom are recognizably Latino, either by physical representation or linguistic behavior. Dora's parents, Mama and Papi, her grandmother Abuela, her cousin Diego, all speak Spanish and English throughout the show. Animals on the program are, as most animals are in children's programming, both racialized and gendered. So you have Benny the bull, Isa the iguana, and Tico the squirrel, among others. The home in which Dora resides with her parents is also has a recognizable Spanish or Latino style. It's adobe. It has a red tile roof. It has kind of tchotchkes, like animated tchotchkes around the house that signify a kind of Latino, at least a U.S. Latino aesthetic. Okay, so I'll just show a quick clip just so you can see what I'm talking about.
Library books. Where are my library books? Do you see any books? Well,